Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IES AERA webinar on using longitudinal data to support state policymaking. I am Felice Levine, Executive Director of the American Educational Research Association. And we'll introduce this session briefly so that we can really start with the meat and heart of this webinar. We really value the turnout of the research community, many working in diverse sectors from across the United States and around the world. And we hope this is of use to you, whether you've been a long-term user of the state longitudinal data systems or recently interested in doing evidence-based policy work through research at the state level. This is a wonderful opportunity that IES is offering. And with this and many other initiatives, working with administrative data and the kind of work pioneered and developed through the National Center for Education Statistics, and in collaboration now with the National Center for Education Research, there is a wonderful opportunity for the research community to engage with evidence-based policy questions at the state level. I will just briefly introduce our presenters so that we get to the session itself. But you will be hearing first from Alan Ruby, who is with the National Center for Education Research. Second, he will be followed by James Benson, also with the National Center for Education Research. And underscoring the partnerships across IES and the centers, you will then be hearing from Nancy Sharkey, who is one of the world-renowned experts in the state longitudinal administrative data systems. And she will be talking from the vantage of the data systems, and she is with the National Center for Education Statistics. For AERA, it was a joy to be able to work with IES, to be asked to partner with them on this webinar, in particular because in our own initiatives, we very much value use of administrative data systems in work with both design data and linkages to other data. In AERA's NSF-funded grants program, we encourage that kind of submission from early career scholars and doctoral students. So for us, it's just one of the multiple modalities that in doing fine scholarship really is of value to the research community and to the valuable work we hope to produce by virtue of this activity. Without further ado, I want to invite to our webinar George Wimberly, who is my colleague at AERA and the Director of Professional Development. We work very closely on capacity building, connecting researchers in this case to the policy communities and to each other, and discovery through data. So I just wanted to briefly mention that AERA has a new initiative of which this webinar is emblematic. In collaboration with ICPSR, where indeed we are seeking to create a hub that networks data of various forms, designed, administrative, qualitative, quantitative data assets, where we want to connect the research communities across our fields, those who identify with our fields and those who are doing work closely related to education and learning processes, and to learn through webinars like this. So without further ado, let me welcome George, who will give you some more details as we start this webinar today.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Felice. I just want to say that we'll hear from our speakers. Each will have some time for their session, and then we'll take questions. We'll take questions in both the chat box as well as the question and answer box. I will then direct those questions to each presenter. And after the end of the 4 sessions, we're going to come back together for some general questions as well. I also want to bring to your attention today that we do have American Sign Language interpreters, ASL interpreters. There are 2 interpreters today, and you will see that who are providing this service. One is labeled as ASL interpreter. The other is ASL interpreter number 2. I suggest that you might want to pin back and forth the interpreters as they are providing ASL services. We are also providing closed captioning for today for this course. you can use the multimedia view box to see the closed captioning. In that box, you will need to, you can enter the session code, password, and name. You can find that information in our own chat. If you go to chat, you have a couple of different options there. One is for a browser link, and then the other is for the actual multimedia view for session code, password, and the name there. I want to thank our ASL interpreters for providing services today. With that, I am going to turn to Alan Ruby for our first presentation.
Thank you, Felice, and thank you, George, and thank you to AERA for collaborating with us on this webinar. Today, we're talking about a new IES grant program using longitudinal data to support state policymaking. State education agencies can use these funds to analyze the data in their state longitudinal data systems in order to provide evidence for their own decision-making. The data can be used on its own or can be linked to other secondary data. And state education agencies can apply for these grants on their own, or they can apply with other organizations as collaborators, including universities, research firms, and other state agencies. So this is the agenda for our webinar today. The webinar is an introduction, but it is not a substitute for reading the request for applications and reading the IES application submission guide. The request for applications will ensure that you are familiar with the requirements and recommendations for writing your application. And the submission guide will make you familiar with any accompanying documents and the process and procedures for submitting your grant application. I'd like to just take a short moment to introduce IES to you. Within the Department of Education, we have a director appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, advised by a national board. In the director's office is the Office of Science, which is responsible for the peer review process for these applications. And then IES is composed of 4 centers: the National Center for Education Statistics. This is where Nancy Sharkey is from, in charge of the SLDS grants program. There is the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance, which does large-scale evaluations and also provides technical assistance through the regional education laboratories and ERIC. And then the research grant-making centers, James and I are in the National Center for Education Research, where this grant program will be housed, and the National Center for Special Education Research also runs separate grant programs. It's important to note that we are separate from the Office of Science, which is in charge of the peer review, which allows us to work closely with applicants. And I will stress that throughout this webinar, that you should contact James and I if you have questions about the grant program and your application. One way of thinking about the objectives of our research grant programs is to try to answer 3 questions. What works to improve student education outcomes so we can expand the use of that and scale it up and scale it out? What doesn't work so we stop using it? And how do interventions work? Are they working only for subgroups, for certain types of students, and under what conditions? Now, there are multiple grants you could apply for to study SLDS data. And before we jump into this grant program, I just wanted to make sure you were aware of them. For example, AERA and NSF have a grant program with a September 10th deadline to examine large-scale education-related data, which would include SLDS. If you're at an institution of higher education at the doctoral or above level, you can apply for these grants. IES itself has its 2 primary research grant programs: education research grants and special education research grants, and these have an August 20th deadline. Under these grants, you apply to a specific project type. And of those 4 project types, 2 of them, exploration and efficacy, are probably the most relevant for SLDS data. Exploration is to do non-causal work. You're looking for correlational and descriptive relationships between factors and student outcomes. And efficacy studies are full evaluations, and often they use state longitudinal data to look at student outcomes. Any organization can apply for these grants. You just need to justify that you're doing the work capable that you're proposing. Now, next I'll go into the using longitudinal data, but as we go through the new grant program, I just want you to keep in mind if you hear something that says, oh, this new grant program probably doesn't work for me. Remember, there are these 3 other grant programs you could apply for as well to carry out an examination of SLDS data. So let's go into the specific grant program, which we also, its CFDA number is 84305S to distinguish it from our other grant programs. The purpose of this grant program is to expand state education agencies' use of the longitudinal data in order for their decision making. So to provide evidence when they are making program and policy decisions. It has a second purpose as an incentive for people to look at longer term student pathways and outcomes, because SLDS has become much more, it's occurred over so much longer time. We can now follow students for a much more longer period, and we can follow many more cohorts. Thirdly, we're trying to support work that SEAs want done because they need to make decisions. And so this type of work is to have very practical implications and be of high use to the SEAs. Let's start with our first general requirement. Who is eligible to be an applicant? Well, you must be the primary K-12 authority in your state or territory. And you must also be on behalf of the SEA. As I mentioned, the SEA can apply on its own, or it can apply in collaboration with other organizations such as state agencies, local education agencies, universities, firms, and other non-governmental organizations. And these organizations can receive a subaward on this grant, and they should provide a co-PI. But the main applicant has to be the primary K-12 education agency. Now, you may say, okay, in my state, the state I want to work with, I want to look at an education issue that's outside the purview of this authority. In many states, pre-kindergarten, post-secondary education, adult education may be handled by another agency. Now, that other agency can be a collaborator on this project, and that's fine. But again, the applicant must be the primary K-12 authority. And if that doesn't work well for you, I'll just send you back, think about the other grant competitions. Also, in some states, there are multiple agencies dealing with K-12. And again, those agencies can all take part, but the applicant must be the primary K-12 authority, the agency that can apply for an SLDS grant has to be the applicant. And again, if that doesn't work, please think about the other grant programs. The next major requirement is that the research must focus on learner education outcomes. So all of our research grants must look at student academic outcomes. These can be defined as learning and achievement in academic content areas, also as progression through the education system. In addition, if the SDA is interested, we encourage you to look at other outcomes such as social and behavioral competencies, career and technical education outcomes, and employment and labor market outcomes. But we're always looking for academic outcomes to be included. Another way of thinking about these outcomes is by age grade in the system. So in K-12, core academic content area outcomes might include standardized test scores, end of course tests, formative tests, exit exams and grades, progression, just moving through the grades, retention, high school graduation, and dropout. In post-secondary education, we're most interested in sub-baccalaureate and baccalaureate education. And this includes developmental education, bridge programs, programs that lead to occupational certificates, associate and bachelor's degrees. And again, you can look at learning and achievement outcomes or access to, progress through, and completion of these programs. Adult education, IES has a specific definition of adult ed. It's for learners who are at least 16 years old outside the K-12 system who are preparing for, transitioning into, or enrolled in adult education as it's defined in Title II of the 2015 Workforce Innovation and Opportunities Act. And this includes adult basic education, adult English literacy programs, and preparation programs for high school equivalency exams. Again, looking at very similar outcomes, achievement in these courses, in these programs, access to them, for progress through them, and completion of them. You are also supposed to be looking at longer-term outcomes, which means going beyond an immediate outcome after a program or an issue ends. There is no specific time limit for longer-term outcomes. You just need to note in your application what's the immediate outcome you're looking at, and then what's a follow-on or longer-term outcome. And let me just think with you about what kinds of projects could you be thinking about doing under this grant program. So a lot of work has been done looking at retrospectively at older cohorts as they progress through the education system, trying to identify what factors were linked to their success or lack of success. So often a lot of work has been done on early warning systems. What characteristics do we see in students that lead to them not succeeding, for example, in Algebra 1 courses, in high school graduation, in college going, and then using those to look at prospectively at students coming up through the system to try to identify those who may not be on track to succeed, and therefore give those students some type of intervention. That's a very typical approach in using this type of data. Another type might be looking at a past analysis and realizing that the SLDS has improved over time and maybe has a new variable that you could use in that analysis, which would give you an additional finding. So a quick example, in one state, they had indicators of English learner students and mainstream students, but they didn't have an indicator of English learner students who had graduated and gone into mainstream education. And what was happening when they were doing comparisons of EL and mainstream students, ELs did not have as good outcomes. Over time, they created an indicator of what they would call ever EL. So students who were in EL, students had graduated out of it. And when you did that comparison of every EL versus mainstream or never EL students, outcomes were very similar, which is very important for policymaking concerning English learners. Another approach might be you did a program in the past, there was actually an evaluation of it, but you only looked at fairly short-term or intermediate outcomes. With the SLDS, you can now look at long-term outcomes. And so typical example of this is pre-K. So students went through pre-K, you may have looked at pre-K, even kindergarten, and maybe first grade outcomes in an old project. But now you have the ability to follow these students up through elementary, middle, high school, and some studies have even gone out into the labor market. So that would be another type of project you could do. Another project could look at if students are recently or currently involved in the program, following them through the rest of this project to see how they do, what are the outcomes of that program for these students. And a fourth approach might be if you implemented a policy at some point and you're curious, how did this policy seem to improve education outcomes, comparing cohorts from before and after the policy was implemented. Now, these are all just examples there. You can obviously come up with other approaches you might want to do with the SLDS data. But just one last thought, if you're going to do any prospective work looking in the future, it will be important to have a plan B in case the 2020 to 21 school year is again interrupted by COVID-19. So either you may want to try to build in some alternate outcomes in case standardized tests are not possible or other things are not collectible, or even pose the possibility that if it's highly interrupted, We just have to shut that down. That will just stop the project for that year and try to start it up in the next year. At this point, I'm going to turn it back to George for the next part of the presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Alan. We do have some time here for some questions, and I know you can pose those questions in the question and answer box or even in chat, preferably the question and answer box here. Oh, one thing I will make a point to say to everyone is that this session is being recorded, and that we will have this recording, this video and audio recording, available later through the AERA website. We'll let you know about that. Okay, one question that we have here, Alan, can you speak a little bit more about the studies that come from this data? Does it have to be K-12? Can one go and look beyond K-12 and look, say, from birth to 3 or beyond the K-12 years?
This work can go anytime from pre-kindergarten or child care center work, because we're not authorized. Our center is not authorized to go earlier in life. We have to start with pre-K all the way through K-12, post-secondary into adult education. So you don't have to focus on K-12. Obviously, if you're using that, if you're SLDS, then you would have to have the pre-K post-secondary data to do this. Or you may say, I want to look at high school to college transition. My SLDS has this high school data. I'm going to link it to some, National Student Clearinghouse data, or our state has a separate data set for post-secondary education. So again, the openness from pre-K up through adult ed, but the issue is, remember, the applicant has to be the K-12 SCA agency in your state or territory. And then you can include other agencies that are looking at the issue you're interested in looking at.
Thank you, Alan. Can you also just clarify what it exactly is an SCA and provide some examples?
We have a list if you want to state, but I can say like the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, the Massachusetts, Elementary and Secondary Department, the Tennessee Department of Education. So every state has one agency that is the primary K-12 agency. And if you have a question about a state, we can respond to you about what agency is it in the state or territory you're interested in working.
Another specific question is regarding the actual awards. Is the grantee or the partner, is that a sub-award or is it part of the larger award?
So it would be a sub-award, and in your application, you would provide a budget for the overall award, and then any sub-awards you were given, and the sub-awards and then you also, in your application, you would describe the primary applicant and all the sub-awardee or the collaborating institutions taking part, and we would hope you would have a co-PI from each collaborating institution, because they would be responsible for the work occurring at their institution.
Thank you. We're getting several.
Have to have a sub-awardee. Again, as I mentioned, an SEA could, if it had the capacity, do all this work on their own.
We're getting several questions, Alan, about the topics that one could focus on using this data and for this grant. Some are asking questions specifically around things like using the NAEP data.
Well, the data that supports this is really using the state administrative data in the longitudinal data systems. So NAEP data you would apply under the other 3 grant programs I mentioned, all support analysis of NAEP data, both the AERA and the 2 IES grant programs. So I would point you to them, because this grant program is really focused on state administrative data.
Great. Another question. do projects need to address both topics such as learning achievement and successful progression?
No, a project must address at least one outcome from one of those categories to meet that requirement. You don't need to address them all. Again, it's really the discretion of the SEA. What outcome are they most interested in? If it's one, one's fine. If it's multiple, multiple is fine as well.
Here's another question regarding sort of the SEAs. Is it possible that there can be multiple SEAs either within a state or across states that apply?
Well, within a state, there may be multiple SEAs within a state. So again, the applicant would be the one that's primarily responsible for K-12. And then let's say if you wanted to look at that transition from high school to college, you might bring in the state agency, the state higher education agency or board could also take part. If you were interested, let's say, in juvenile justice, you might have the K-12 agency involved, and then you might bring in the agency for juvenile justice to support that if you wanted to look at educational students in the juvenile justice system. So you could, now across states, that's a little more difficult unless, I mean, I could see that, let's say, if you're in a regional area or like multiple cities met at the border, and there was like a labor market that was shared by two states. And so both states might want to work together looking at the outcomes, academic outcomes and labor market outcomes and share that, or if they shared some other common issue. But I'm having a little more trouble. Oh, the other issue you might be if you had two states far apart who had implemented the same program and they wanted to do a joint evaluation of it together. That would certainly make sense. I mean, the issue, though, is as you add more states, management becomes much more difficult and the funding doesn't go up for having more states. So the funding would have to be shared across both of them.
Thank you, Alan. Well, that is time for that first session. I want to shift now to bring on James Benson. We'll start.
So good afternoon, everybody. The intent of my presentation is to give you some advice on constructing a successful application to IES. Some of you may be familiar with this process from previous applications, and others of you, this might be your first time. So I hope I can, make some ideas here that are relevant to both groups. The project narrative is truly the heart of your application, and your success depends upon a responsive, compelling, and detailed narrative. However, keep in mind that there is a series of steps necessary for successfully submitting an IES application. The go-to reference for these steps is the application submission guide, which we provide in a link later in the presentation. To be responsive to the RFA, you must include the 4 listed sections in your narrative. Some general advice for your narrative section. First, make your narrative easy to jump into and read any section of. Use common terminology across sections. Remind your reader of points that you have already detailed in a previous section, or preview a point that you intend to elaborate on in a future section. For those of you who are familiar with the narrative structure for an education research grant application, please note that there are not separate personnel and resource sections. You should list the main activities of key persons in Section 2 for the research plan, Section 3 for data, and Section 4 for decision-making and dissemination. Please note also that there are suggested and required appendices, which I will present after I cover the narrative section. For an application to succeed, the content of your significance section must surmount what I refer to as the significance hurdle. which is the threshold for reviewers to consider a proposal as important and apropos. For this competition, justifying the proposal as it relates to the key issue, program, or policy of concern to the SEA is key to getting over what I refer to as the significance hurdle. You should provide a cogent but concise argument for how addressing the listed research questions will help the SEA in its decision making. However, you will elaborate on this process in Section 4 for decision making and dissemination, and you can further support it in your letters of agreement, which you will include in Appendix B. The key issue, program, or policy will connect to a specific or broad population of learners, and you should be clear about this population as it exists in the state where the research will be taking place. The key issue, program, or policy should also connect to key learner outcomes, and you should be specific about these outcomes. You will enhance the external validity of your proposal by noting similarities between the student population in your state, the outcomes you will be tracking, and the student groups and learner outcomes of concern to policymakers nationwide. Your significance section should list the research questions that you plan to address, and these should be based upon the questions that state policymakers are asking. The significance section is also a place to introduce your team, but remember that you will be providing details about their activities in subsequent sections of the narrative. To be responsive to the RFA, your research plan section must include a description of your research design, the type of analysis you plan to do, whether it is descriptive, correlational, predictive, or causal, and data analysis procedures that you plan to employ. When discussing the setting and sample to be studied, make sure that your detailed description here is consistent with your introduction to it in the significance section. Here you should inform the reader of the exact sources from which you will be drawing your sample, the period over which you will be drawing data, and your expected sample sizes. It is important to convince the reader that your SLDS has valid program measures. In the absence of such extant measures, you should describe how you will collect, merge, and code the data needed to arrive at the necessary measures. The term longer-term outcomes in the RFA is deliberately broad. It is up to you, the applicant, to make the case that your outcome measures fit into this category. When describing your analysis, I suggest that you be upfront and honest about the extent to which your design and analysis methods will support causal claims about your findings. When describing your data analysis, you should satisfy the methodologists on the review panel by describing the structure of your data, including such features as multiple levels of data, patterns of missing data, and differences in data collection and measures across cohorts. You should address factors in addition to and beyond the focal issue, program, or policy that may affect your analysis. These factors may include your choice of analytical methods, programmatic factors other than the focal issue, program, or policy, and heterogeneity in effects across the student population. Although it is not required, if you are using a sample, you can include a power analysis, include estimates for subgroups. A good power analysis section will include a discussion of substantively meaningful effect sizes. If you are using a census, you may also want to address the topic of substantively meaningful effect sizes, since small effects are likely to be statistically significant. In the conclusion to your research plan section, you will want to convince a methodologist that your proposed research will provide enough information to address your stated research questions, and you will want to convince a policymaker of the practical use of your findings. I suggest that you introduce the potential implications of your findings here and that you refer back to them in section 4 for decision-making and dissemination. To be responsive to the RFA, your data section must confirm that you have access to the SLDS necessary to carry out your proposed research and indicate that your team has the expertise necessary to work with the data. Remember that you will also be noting this in your Appendix B, which will include a letter of agreement from the SEA that will be providing the SLDS. A few suggestions for your data section. Make sure to describe the structure of the main SLDS that you will be working with, including its sources and constituent data sets. Describe any non-SLDS data sets that will be included in your research data and how they will be linked to the main SLDS, including the identifiers you will use for merging. Describe the component variables and their coding without using too much space in your narrative. Remember, your narrative can be no longer than 22 pages. So, a list of variables can be included in Appendix A. This appendix can be a maximum of 15 pages long, so there is room for detailed coding information if you feel that reviewers need to have access to it. However, I suggest that you refer the reader to such information if it is included in the appendix, as they may not find it on their own. If you use measures that conform to the Common Education Data Standards, I suggest that you also mention this in your narrative. Make sure to introduce the key personnel that will be working with the data, their experience with the data, and the specific activities that they will be carrying out in support of the proposed research. Also, do the same for others who will be working with the data, such as personnel at agencies that provide data to the SLDS, or researchers that will be partnering with the SEA to carry out the research. To be responsive to the RFA, your application must include a decision-making and dissemination section that describes how you will present the project's findings to SEA leadership and target audiences within the state and beyond the state. Your decision-making and dissemination section should make a case that the project team's presentation of findings will be compelling to and actionable by the SEA and state policymakers that receive them. You may want to discuss how these audiences usually receive research findings and how comfortable they are with presentations of research designs, regression coefficients, effect sizes, etc. You will want to discuss how you will frame the findings in terms of their sufficiency for supporting decision-making. This discussion can tie back to your research design as presented in your research plan section. Remember that null or negative findings may be equally as important as positive findings, and think through how you would present such findings, assuming that they are a possible outcome of your research. We require that your plan will push out your findings to multiple audiences beyond the SEA at the state and national levels. IES-funded projects such as R&D centers and regional educational laboratories may be interested in your findings and may provide a platform for further dissemination. As with the data section, your decision-making and dissemination section should introduce the key personnel that will be disseminating the project's findings, their experience with dissemination to specific audiences, and the specific activities that they will be carrying out in support of disseminating the research findings. Also, do the same for others who will be assisting with the dissemination, such as researchers or other key persons or staff on the project team. Appendix A is an optional section that can include up to 15 pages of supplemental materials, including tables, charts, and lists that support your narrative. Content longer than 15 pages will not be included in the application sent to reviewers. Appendix B is required and must include a letter of agreement from the SEA office that controls the SLDS, as well as all participating organizations, including data providers, universities, research firms, and consultants. There is no page limit for Appendix B. Finally, the maximum award amount is $1.0 million, and the maximum duration for a project is 3 years. As with all IES applications, your requested budget should be commensurate with the scope of the work that you propose. And with that said, I am going to turn it back to George.
Thank you, James. Well, as we are taking questions again in the question and answer box, Q&A box, we did have a few questions here that have come up. First, James, one question is how can we get obtain a copy of a successful grant proposal?
Yeah, that's a very good question, George. And unlike some other agencies, we don't publish the successful applications. So the best way to get access to one would be through a colleague.
Okay, thank you. Another questions that come up here are, does the grant program prioritize specific types of analyses, such as causal studies or?
George, your sound has gone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm gonna try again here. Okay, here's the question. Does the grant program prioritize specific studies such as those used causal studies, or is it equally weighted across from causal or exploratory or other types of descriptive studies?
Okay, so that's a good question, and there are two parts to it. And so I'm going to address the first part, and that is that the Institute does not provide scoring rubrics to our reviewers. What we do is we rely upon their expert interpretation of the RFA. Okay, so to get to part two of the question, no, there's not a more of a weight for a causal design than there is for an exploratory design or a descriptive one. The key determining factor here is going to be the significance, which is going to be determined by the relevance of the research agenda to key questions that policymakers in the state are concerned with.
Thank you. Another question. Is it possible for the state data to be linked with health data to address an education question?
Yes, it is. But we want to back up to Alan's presentation and some of what he mentioned there, which is that the SLDS needs to be the foundation, if you may, of the research data that's going to be used for the project. Okay, so if there's not a role for the SLDS, then this is not the venue for that particular research application. But if the SLDS is a key part of the research, of the data for the research, then whatever additional data that the researcher wants to link is up to them. And health outcomes or labor market outcomes or criminal justice outcomes, all of those are fair game.
Thank you. Can you talk about a little bit more about how a faculty member at an institution might collaborate with an SCA?
So what I'd like to do is I would like to punt on that question because I know that my colleague Nancy Sharkey from NCES is going to address that very topic in her upcoming presentation.
Another question about looking at the characteristics of one's study. Specifically, could one focus on specific groups of students, such as racial ethnic minorities within a state, immigrant students within a state, gender differences, for example?
Yes. A researcher can do that.
Okay. I know that you probably addressed some of this earlier, though. Apparently on the website for IES, there's some information about there was a letter of intent due back in May for this grant. Has that been changed?
It hasn't been changed, but let me just clarify that in terms of whether it's a requirement or a recommendation. And it's definitely a recommendation, but not a requirement. And so what Alan and I are encouraging people that are interested in this competition to do is just to send us either an unofficial LOI or send us a short prospectus of your proposed research. We understand that it took some time for us to start publicizing this grant opportunity. So it's completely understandable that people might be a little bit behind the curve and may have missed that letter of intent deadline entirely.
Great. We're still taking questions. If people are out there who are part of this, participants want to put questions into the box. Opening up here to other questions. Could you give also, James, any examples of state data sets or the data that is available in the states? What are some of the variables, some examples? Specifically, if people are asking questions about things, not only we talked about earlier some different demographics, like race, but other things around income, for example.
Right. So again, Nancy is the expert to consult on this because there's a considerable variation across the states in terms of what's included in the SLDS, and NCES has provided grants in varying amounts to states, and states have proposed to bring different constituent data sources into their SLDS. So it varies considerably from state to state. George, I'd like to go out on a limb, if I might, here and answer a question that came up regarding COVID-19. And there was somebody asking whether COVID-19 could be considered a policy or something like a policy. In other words, could COVID-19 become the focus of study for an application under this program? And My answer to that is it could be with some finessing, and I think what we would be most interested in would be would be a research proposal that went beyond just looking at COVID-19 and its effects, but also looked at how districts and schools responded to the crisis. And I think that would be a more compelling application if that could be done along with some descriptive work to look at the correlation between the COVID-related shutdown and student outcomes. That being said, we can give this some more thought, and I think that we would lean in the direction of wanting to support projects that are examining effects associated with the COVID crisis.
One question that's come up also, James, looking at issues around citizenship, for the collaborators with SCAs, is it limited to U.S. citizens?
No. In terms of our enabling legislation, we are only constrained in the sense that the research that we support has to be relevant to education in the United States, and that includes citizens and non-citizens.
Okay. As we keep our questions coming here, I think some of these questions are going to be answered a little bit later. Here's another question though. Around SCA staff members. Can SCA staff members who work directly with the Slds data apply for grants and be the PI?
I think absolutely so. I'm not quite sure why that question is coming up. Is this a question about whether the whether leadership of the SCA has to be the PI? My sense of it, my sense of it is that there's no problem with that, but I want to turn it over to Alan so he can respond to that. Alan, can you fill in on that one?
Absolutely. If the SCA itself has the personnel and capacity to do the research, we would support that. Now, what often happens though with SCA personnel is they're not as well known in the field because they're working on their state issue. They may not be publishing, they may not be presenting, and therefore they might be as well known when they go to the peer review panel. The peer review panel looks at the personnel and may say, can this person do the work? What's the evidence that they've had a grant before, that they do research before? If the person has that background, has published, has led a grant, has done such analyses, then they are an excellent person to lead the project and apply, and their agency should apply for the grant.
Thank you, Alan. James. One other question here. This is a good question here about, as people are putting together their proposals, if they have not had access to the data yet, the state data, what are some tips, or how can they write about some of the variables if they have not had a chance to have access to this data?
Can I come in on here, George?
Sure.
If the SCA is the applicant, the SCA has to want this issue addressed. If the SCA isn't on board, you should apply to one of the other grant programs. Because if at this point, the SCA hasn't come, you're not working together with the SCA at this point, I think you're in a difficult position because the SCA has to be the prime applicant, provide the PI, and the Data Institute for the SCA has to provide a letter saying, yes, we support this project and we're going to give the data to use it. So this is not an application where a researcher writes it and then shocks it to the SCA. This is an application where researcher and the SCA has been talking from the beginning, is writing the application together, and has strong joint agreement. And for that reason, I'd say it sounds like, and I'm not trying to lecture you here or browbeat you here, I'm just saying this sounds more like a project that you want to go to one of the other grant programs. You're still going to need SCA permission, but some SCAs have an application process where you can apply to use their data. And in that case, they might be willing to come on with just a letter of agreement saying, if you get the grant, you can work with us on this data as we're interested. But under this grant program, if it's not an SCA, if you and the SCA should be working from the start, and you should have a good idea of what the data is already.
If I could, this is Felice, if I could just add to what Alan said, even though I'm not officially here an IES expert, but I want to underscore that that some of what's embedded in that question are general issues that we try to take up in the use of state longitudinal administrative data systems. But the reason why this is scheduled June 11th, with us still having something of a runway until July 30th, is to give interested researchers and indeed interested SCAs an opportunity to work together. So while that general question has applicability for use and access to data within the state systems, in this particular case, as Alan said, except I would say don't be discouraged, because part of why we've scheduled this webinar is for the very purpose of trying to, as I said, connect the research community with the SCAs and the SCAs with the research communities and researchers within SCAs to work together on this very significant project. So you should not yet feel discouraged unless you had read the RFA and knocked on doors and found brick walls. If you haven't, this is the perfect opportunity to begin working on how to make connections. And I think that's probably a theme Nancy will take up as well.
Great. Thank you. And I think there's going to be some other talk about how actually, in Nancy's presentation, about how you can build these collaborations between SCAs and other researchers. Okay. Well, I want to thank James for his presentation and Alan Felice for also addressing some of those questions. As we're going to get ready to hear again from Alan Ruby, who's going to talk a little bit about the actual application submission process and review processes here. So, Alan, you're putting there we go. Here, handing over to you, Alan.
Thank you, George. I was intrigued by one question that went to James, and I'd just like to take 30 seconds on that. Someone asked, can we look at health data too? And I think another distinction is, remember, you're doing this grant, you're doing this research to support the state education agency. So, for example, if schools had like telemedicine clinics in them and run by the district, and the districts wanted to know, is student attendance higher? Is participation higher because of these clinics? That makes great sense to do that research, because your research can then feed into the state's decision to continue to expand or not these telemedicine units based in schools. On the other hand, if your research was, do coal plants lead, or schools around coal plants, what is the health effects? That's a little harder to argue, because you could say, I'm going to go to the state and say, look, these coal plants are not beneficial to the students located near them. But is that something the state education agency can to do something about versus some other agency, regulatory agency in the state or the federal government? So the distinction of using non-education data or looking at perhaps education interventions is, is this information helpful to the state education agency? So thank you for that. just talking a little bit about application submission and review. So just some important dates, as James mentioned, we had a letter of intent due on May 28th. It's not required. It's not used in the submission process or the review process. It's helpful to us so that we can give advice to folks saying your idea fits very well or your idea might fit under a better competition. And as James said, if you'd like to get our feedback along those lines, please send us a short email with a synopsis of your research idea and who will be carrying it out so we can give you feedback. The applications themselves are due on July 30th before midnight, and please don't be late because we are not allowed to accept applications. We're not allowed to accept for review applications that come in later. And your project may start anywhere between March 1st and September 1st of 2021 if you are recommended for funding. I noticed someone asked, can a state submit more than one application? As long as you're addressing a substantively different issue, you can submit multiple applications from the same education agency. All applications are submitted through grants.gov, and there are application packages already there waiting for you if you want to download them to fill them out. If you're not familiar, it's really a good idea to start working on that soon because while we have the IES submissions guide to help you, and while grants.gov also has its own help desk, it is a bureaucratic process. And there are some registrations you may have to go through ahead of time. So it's worth starting that process even while you're writing your application earlier on. Key steps, again, we request that you review the request for applications so you understand the requirements and recommendations that James went through for the 4 sections of your project narrative. That you email us an idea so that we can give you feedback on it, that you download the application packet, start working with it early from grants.gov, and that you review the application submission guide so you know what needs to be included and how to actually submit. You submit your application, it's reviewed for compliance and responsiveness to the request for applications. So if it meets everything we asked for, then it's assigned to a review panel. On that panel, 2 to 3 panel members conduct a primary review of each application. The focus is on those 4 sections. So as James went over them, reviewers are asked to review each section based on the recommendations and the request for application. And that's why it's so important to review the recommendations in the request for application. They then score it, and then applications are ranked according to their score, and then the most competitive applications go to the full panel. The full panel discusses them at a meeting and scores them once again. And then we try to fund, depending on our budget, all applications that are scored as outstanding or excellent. If your application is reviewed by the 2 to 3 panel members that does not go to the full panel, you will get those panel members' reviews. If it does go to full panel, you'll get those the primary panel members' reviews, the overall summary of the discussion by the full panel, and the score provided by the full panel. If you want to know more about the peer review process, which is run by our Standards and Review Office, please go to this website. Once you submit an application, you'll get an email asking you to sign up to open an account on our applicant notification system at this website. You'll sign up, and then you'll get another email letting you know that there's information in there. You can track the status of your application. Is an award made? Did it go to full panel or not? And then you can access the reviews and also the scores if there are scores for your application. A reminder that, again, we consider ourselves a resource. We're happy to talk to you about your research idea. All you need to do is email us the idea, and then we'll get your feedback. And if you want to talk, we'll try to schedule a time for a talk. As you're writing, you may want to email us short questions that come up. There's not a lot of time, but if we get some draft applications or portions of applications, we will try to give you feedback on them. And if you do submit and you do not receive award, we will discuss your reviews with them once you receive them. We're not sure this is a new grant program, so we're hoping it will be recompeted next year and that you will be in a position to do a resubmission. So I'm going to turn it back to George now.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan. I know we are still taking some questions there in the box, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this next section over to Nancy Sharkey, who is going to talk a little bit more about the Slds data, and then we'll open up for questions at the end with everyone.
Okay. So the first thing I want to do is thank you all for having me here to talk a little bit about the SLDS programs themselves, to give some context for the systems, the data that you might be able to access, data uses that we have supported in the past, and also talk a little bit about what effective collaborations have looked like historically, because I think that's going to be critical as we embark on this work. Some of you may know that we have been using SLDS data for research, and it was a focus of the SLDS grant program and of states and territories historically. Typically, states are using the SLDS programs to try to answer questions that are relevant. They're all local questions and they're local systems. So the extent to which you're going to be able to work effectively with the state is really going to depend on your ability to create an effective collaboration with that state. Ideally, what states are looking for are questions that can inform their own decision making by educators and policymakers. So again, focusing very much on questions that states want to answer is probably the best way to go, as Alan indicated. We did do evaluation and research grants with our FY15 SLDS grant round, and we have worked with states that have created effective partnerships with researchers, both internal researchers and external researchers. So we've been working on developing tools and tips for researchers and states trying to work together. We also have worked with the National Forum for Education Statistics, which also has focused a lot on helping states develop the capacity to create effective collaborations with researchers. So what's important to know is that states and territories often have established research agendas and partnerships to do this work. However, they're always looking for additional help, which is where I think you all are going to come in. The first thing, and some of you have already asked questions about this, the first thing you'd want to do is find out what states are interested in learning about. Most states and territories have an SLDS, and almost all of them have functioning K-12 SLDS systems. So that at least is a starting point. The majority of them can also link one or more education sectors to their systems, and that could be prepay or post-secondary. Some of them are bringing in data from HHS type agencies. Some of them are bringing in juvenile justice. And about half of them can also link workforce data. What you all have already asked a question about, though, is how do you know what's in their system? Because as we know, they don't all have the same data elements, they don't all have the same years of data, and they certainly don't all have the same data quality. So, what the first thing I would do if I were working on this project is, if I were starting from scratch, is start looking at state websites. So most of the state education agency websites have some place where they have listed research questions or research agendas or policy questions or policies that they're interested in. And I think you'd really want to start there to dig into, what sorts of questions are they interested in, and what sorts of policies are they implementing that you might want to evaluate. But then they also sometimes, we suggest that they do anyway, have data dictionaries, which would basically make their systems transparent so that you can see at least the data elements that they're collecting. You might still have to reach out to them and they'll work with you to figure out precisely what they mean by specific elements or precisely what's in a specific data field. But oftentimes you can get a really good start if you start with the state education agency website. We've provided a link to the SLDS program website because we have links to a lot of the state's education agencies, particularly the ones that have grants that are active. And usually through that, you can see what states are interested in. You can also look at the applications that the FY15 grants submitted, which also gives you a sense of the types of questions that states are interested in answering. So when we talk about what makes for a successful partnership, and I think a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory. Do you have aligned expectations, interests, and goals? Are you expecting an agreed upon deliverable? Are you going to provide something that's going to meet the needs of this grant, but also are you going to make briefings for policymakers? Are you going to provide information for stakeholders that the states might want to have answered? What are the expectations when it comes to getting data? What happens if you need additional data because you're doing the research and you realize another variable would be helpful? What's the expectation for the state providing that data in a timely way? And how does this all work as this project evolves? You need to have good project management and regular communication, both on the SVA side and on the research side, with clear, understood, deliverable deadlines. The states that are most effective at this also have regularly scheduled communications with the research teams. The ones that I know who are most effective usually work with their researchers weekly, just to keep updated on where the research is, but also where the state is. Obviously, the SEAs are going to be the PIs on these projects, so I think we will probably develop research projects that are useful. But I could give you one example from the FY15 grant round, and it's a state, like most states, is trying to increase the number of students who are getting to and then through post-secondary education. And the state developed a bunch of policy interventions to see what works best to help kids move through the pipeline successfully. They designed these interventions with research in mind. So to try to really figure out, here's 3 or 4 different things we could do. Let's assign kids to different groups, and then let's do research to try to figure out which intervention or which interventions make the most difference with regard to getting kids through, looking at different demographic groups and other different characteristics of the students. They are working with a researcher who is evaluating this as they go, and really with the goal of figuring out which policy interventions make the most sense for that state to complete. So I think that's sort of the ideal, but that's an example of a research project that's going to be useful both to the state, but also to the field. Another way that you all could think about figuring out what's in state data systems is using the Common Education Data Standards for Research. So CDS is an education data management initiative, which basically gives everyone a shared vocabulary to talk about data elements. So if you're trying to figure out what does a state mean when they say progression, or when they even say like SES, the states, or some of the states, have mapped their systems so that you could see exactly if there is an SES variable in the state student information system, what it means, which would help you know, is this a state that you're going to be able to work with? Or if you don't have the same understanding of a variable, you could ask up front to figure out if there's another variable that would actually meet the need that you're envisioning. CDS has a data model so that you can see the structure of the data in the system. There are also tools for mapping state data systems, for aligning systems, so you can see how states actually look against other state systems if they're mapped to the system. And then there's also something called a connection, which enables folks, and we've done this for some starter questions. You could put a research question into a CDS Connect tool, and then you could identify the variables in CDS that you would answer that question with. You could then enter your analytic strategy, and then you could put additional notes about what you had to do to answer the question. This sort of activity helps states see what each other are doing, could help researchers see what other states are doing, and taking advantage of tools like mapping and align and even connect could also help you identify states to work with. So if you're still in the market for a state, this might be a place to start. The SLDS program collaborates with a lot of other groups in the Department of Education and outside of the Department of Education because we recognize that these data are coming from many different places and there are many different perspectives on how to collect, store, use, and report on data. So we're working obviously here with the National Center for Education Research to make sure that these research questions are in the helping states meet their needs. We obviously work on the Common Education Data Standards to help create a common vocabulary for talking about data. We work with the forum, which is comprised of SEA and the LEA members who give a lot of terrific feedback and come up with a lot of documents on their own to help further the conversation about data use and data access and just data itself. We are all working together on this because we think it's critically important for researchers and states to get together to answer questions to further the goals of the states, usually just to improve the outcomes for students in their systems. This last slide is just a list of some resources that we have created. There's a webinar that we already did on using longitudinal data to support state policymaking. That webinar URL is here. We have toolkits that we have created with states to help states think through the research process. We also have CDS resources for researchers to help you understand how you could use CDS to help your work. And then the forum, as I said, has created some guides to help state folks and LEA folks think about how to work with researchers and how to be good partners when it comes to sharing data for research purposes. This last slide is just our contact information. And also, we just wanted to let you know that if you have any questions about the SLDS side of this, there is a state support team, and we have a lot of technical assistance. The states all have a technical assistance person assigned to them, so we have clear points of contact. But if you have any questions, you could always reach out to us as well. That's what I have.
Great. Thank you so much. We are also accepting questions, a few questions in the chat box and the question and answer box. One thing, Nancy, I think it would be great if you could address, this came up a few times here in the questions. Can you address how the research project should align with any of the state's or reporting requirements?
Well, I think that would be up to the state. I do think a lot of states have the basic reporting requirements sorted out. However, they may want to dive deeper into data that are included in those reports. But, so I think, it would largely depend on how you identify a state to do work with. If there is a state that is having or struggling with reporting, that might be something to talk about with that state. But there are other states that are really trying to figure out research questions. For those states, it would make more sense to go with more in-depth research questions. Sorry, I can't help
Okay,
more with that one, but I
great.
think it's just very state specific.
Thank you. Can you also give any strategies though for a faculty member who wants to work with the state yet may not necessarily know where to start?
I would really start with the state education agency websites to figure out if there are specific policies that the state is implementing, specific questions that they're trying to explore. Another place that we think folks could go to, is there a state of the state address that you could look at to see what a governor's priorities are? Was there recently an election, a state board election, a gubernatorial election? That would also give you an indication into the types of questions that the states are specifically interested in exploring. Once you have that, then you can often just approach the state education agency. Some of them have very specific protocols for reaching out to try to do research with them, as Alan alluded to. Some of them, it'll be an email address and you'll have to work that way. But I really think starting with the state education agency websites to explore the state policy priorities and then formulate the research question that you might want to do based on that priority.
Great. Thank you. One other question here. His question is it possible to partner with a school district within a state?
I think that might be a question for Alan.
Okay, well, maybe this, yeah, hi.
Sure. You can let's see. The applicant has to be the primary K-12 state education agency, so they have to be in the partnership. But let's say one district or several districts were trying something new. The state wanted to know how successful is it, because we're interested in expanding it if it is successful, and therefore you would want the local education agencies, to be involved in the study. That's how you could do it. You could not just have a partnership where the district applied and you were collaborating with them. That would not be acceptable.
Thank you. How about for now, let me bring everyone back, bring James back as well. And we're going to open up to all of our participants, our audience, if there are any other questions that you have for anyone here of our panelists today. James, Nancy, or Alan. Okay. Can someone, this is a question I think any of you probably can answer here. Can you give an example of projects that where you have a faculty member partnering with the state?
Oh, just a general example?
Yeah, just some general examples, yes.
Certainly. For example, we have a project coming to an end where Tennessee Department of Education partnered with both University of Michigan and University of North Carolina to look at their dual credit programs in high school. To see, did those students, were they more likely to go on to college? Were they more likely to go on to 4 years versus 2 years? Did they spend less time going on to college, because if they passed the test for the course, they would receive college credit if they went to a public school in Tennessee. And also they were very interested in who took these courses. Was it the same students who were taking IB or AP, or were they attracting a different group of students? So that would be one example of a collaboration with the state. Another collaboration was with collaboration with, I don't remember the university, but collaborated with Kentucky, looking at Kentucky's school improvement program. They had a specific model for the schools scoring lowest 5% on the standardized test scores. very personnel intensive model, people, coaches coming into the schools. That study has already put out a paper, I believe, which showed that the intervention was not successful, unfortunately. Another study looked in Florida. Florida had a program. This was with the research firm CNA, had a program where they moved developmental education courses from community colleges down into high school. And so it looked at, did that transition benefit the students better prepared to go on to college based on that intervention. One interesting finding there was the program was initially voluntary and then mandatory. And one finding was hardly anybody took up the program when it was voluntary, but there was high take-up when it became mandatory. Another ongoing study is in Maryland, looking at their positive behavioral support program, working with both Johns Hopkins University and the University of Virginia. And that study, actually doing 3 different studies looking at that, and currently is finding beneficial impacts of the program on improving student behavioral outcomes and academic outcomes. And that study is also documenting the cost of this program to the school, to the district, and to the state.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question here. Is there a specific budget format required?
There is a format, and that is provided in the IES applications guide. There is a special budget form that you will fill out. You'll download that form and fill it out, and then you'll also write a budget justification describing what each item in the budget form covers, and that is described in the application submission guide.
Thank you. Another question here is this is a question about eligibility for SEAs. Would Guam as a school district be able to apply and other U.S. territories?
Yeah, I believe Guam, Mariana, am I saying that right? Islands, U.S. Virgin Islands would all be eligible, all have an education agency that could apply.
Right. Well, that looks like we're getting to the end of our questions here. Are there other comments from the panelists?
We see we are just about at that hour where we had indicated we would stop, and we know how busy everyone's time is. We hope in this presentation that we've engaged your interest, both in this initiative in particular, which has many, many opportunities for many, many questions, as Alan just, so effectively illustrated in his responses. Each of the presentations will be posted, as will be the webinar. We'll post the slides separately. We will look both at the Q&A box and the chat box and synthesize and provide some additional responses to facts. I think probably our underlying message in thanking you all for the work you do and are interested in interesting you and intriguing you with the value of looking at policy questions with the state longitudinal administrative data systems is that you will sense a welcomeness on the part of IES and our colleague program offices and on the part of AERA to work with you. We talked about at the beginning how important data are of various forms and administrative data systems and I among them. Our possibilities as a research community to connect in meaningful ways with policy persons at the state level, at the district level, through this kind of initiative and others, and to learn together through webinars like this. So we welcome your feedback through the email box through which you were invited, and we will continue to work with IES NSF and other funders of important education research and the production of important data of value to evidence-based policy making and to the advancement of knowledge together. So I just want to end by not only thanking the hundreds who've joined us today, but also Alan and James and Nancy, and no small amount of thanks also to being at the hot seat of moderating and synthesizing the questions, George Wimberly, for what you've done, and much thanks to the research community to continuing to do the important work that you do and hang in there during this difficult time. This is a time where we can still do significant work together. And those of us in a position to help craft what that will be want to hear from you. So thank you. And whatever your time zone, we hope the rest of your day or evening is productive and satisfying.